Have you ever been so certain about something absolutely, completely sure only to have someone you love look you in the eye and tell you it never happened that way? Not in a let's figure this out together kind of way, but with that patient, almost pitying tone that makes you feel like you're losing your grip on reality? That's what happened to me on an ordinary Tuesday evening, standing in my own kitchen, chopping vegetables for a dinner I can still remember in perfect detail. My husband said 5 words that would eventually change everything. You always remember things wrong. And the terrifying part? I almost believed him. This is a toxic marriage story, but not the kind you might expect. There was no yelling, no obvious cruelty, no dramatic incidents that would make me the sympathetic protagonist in someone else's Netflix series. Instead, it was something far more insidious, a slow, methodical erosion of my confidence in my own mind, orchestrated by a controlling husband who'd discovered that questioning my memory was the perfect tool for maintaining control. The gaslighting memory manipulation was so subtle, so wrapped in concern and apparent helpfulness, that I'd spent months apologizing for having a bad memory when my memory was actually fine. The problem was never my recall, it was his need to rewrite reality. If you've ever had someone tell you that's not what I said when you know exactly what they said, if you've felt that sickening doubt creep in when a partner insists you're confused or mistaken, if you've started second-guessing your own perceptions because someone else's version always seems to win, this story is for you. Because what I did next wasn't what anyone expected, least of all me. I didn't confront him, didn't demand couples therapy, didn't stage an intervention with friends and family. I did something simpler and far more powerful. I started writing everything down. What began as a desperate attempt to prove I wasn't crazy became an unexpected journey toward emotional power reversal. A silent revenge marriage story where the revenge was simply refusing to forget. This is about kitchen gaslighting that extended far beyond any single room, about dark relationship drama that played out in whispers and corrections rather than screams, and ultimately about a female empowerment story that taught me the most radical thing you can do in an emotional manipulation marriage is trust yourself enough to document the truth. And it all started with a notebook, a pen, and the quiet decision to believe my own memory over his convenient revisions. It was a Tuesday evening, nothing special, just another weeknight with dinner simmering on the stove and the sound of a knife chopping vegetables filling the kitchen. Emma had her hair pulled back in a messy bun, an apron she'd gotten as a wedding gift tied around her waist, and she was telling James about the conversation she'd had with his mother earlier that day. It felt ordinary, comfortable, even the kind of domestic routine that's supposed to be the foundation of a good marriage. She mentioned that his mom had suggested they come over on Saturday for his dad's birthday celebration. James looked up from his phone, his expression shifting in that subtle way Emma had learned to notice but hadn't yet learned to trust. Saturday? My mom said Sunday when I talked to her yesterday, he said, his tone casual but with an edge underneath. Emma paused mid-chop, replaying the phone call in her mind. She was certain, absolutely certain, that his mother had said Saturday, had even mentioned making his dad's favorite lemon cake that morning so it would be fresh. The protagonist expected understanding, maybe a simple let me check with her, but that's not what happened. I'm pretty sure she said Saturday, Emma replied, keeping her voice light, trying not to make it into a thing. She rinsed the vegetables under the tap, the water running loud enough to fill the silence that had suddenly stretched between them. This should have been a non-issue, the kind of minor scheduling confusion that couples clarify with a quick text or phone call. Her emotional guard was completely lowered. Why wouldn't it be? They were just talking about a birthday party, planning their weekend, doing the normal things married people do. But there's something about toxic marriage story dynamics that turn the mundane into minefields. What Emma didn't realize yet was that this wasn't really about Saturday versus Sunday, about her memory versus his, or even about his mother's actual words. This was about something much more insidious, a pattern that had been building so gradually she'd adapted to it like a frog in slowly boiling water. The kitchen, with its warm lighting and smell of garlic and herbs, was about to become the stage for a performance she didn't know she'd been cast in. James set his phone down with that deliberate care that always preceded his helpful corrections. Emma, you always remember things wrong, he said, shaking his head with what looked like genuine concern but felt like something else entirely. The phrase landed in the kitchen like a stone dropped in still water, sending ripples through everything she thought she knew about the conversation with his mother. Not maybe you misheard or let me double-check, but a definitive statement about her fundamental inability to retain accurate information. The controlling husband mechanism was so smooth, so practiced, that it almost sounded like he was doing her a favor by pointing out this apparent flaw. She felt her certainty waver, which was exactly the point. I'm sure she said Saturday, Emma repeated, but her voice had already lost its conviction. James sighed, that patient, long-suffering sigh had perfected over their 3 years of marriage. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You do this all the time. Remember last month when you swore I said we'd go to your sister's on the 15th, but it was actually the 22nd? Or when you insisted I promised to pick up milk, but I never said that? Each example he cited felt like evidence in a trial she hadn't realized she was attending, reality being reframed and reshaped until she couldn't tell what was solid ground anymore. The gaslighting memory manipulation was so subtle, so consistent, that Emma had started keeping a mental catalog of her own supposed mistakes. Maybe she did remember things wrong. Maybe her memory wasn't as reliable as she thought. She had always been good with details, had worked in project management where precision mattered, but James seemed so certain, so confident in his version of events. And he never got angry about it. That was the thing that made it so confusing. He just sounded disappointed, like a teacher with a student who kept making the same error despite repeated corrections. I could have sworn. Emma started, but James was already moving on, scrolling through his phone to find the text exchange with his mother. See, she clearly says Sunday here. I don't know why you'd think Saturday. He showed her the screen, and there it was, Sunday, 2 p.m. written in his mother's characteristic short sentences. But Emma hadn't seen that text Shed spoken to his mother on the phone. The doubt had been planted so carefully, so methodically, that she found herself apologizing. You're right, I must misunderstood her. The words tasted wrong in her mouth, but she said them anyway, watching as James' expression softened into forgiveness for a mistake she wasn't even sure Shed made. Over the following weeks, Emma noticed something shifting inside her, a quiet erosion of the confidence Shed always taken for granted. She started second-guessing herself in conversations, pausing before stating facts, adding qualifiers like I think or maybe to statements she would have delivered with certainty before. The kitchen gaslighting incident wasn't isolated. It had become a template for dozens of small interactions where James would gently, almost kindly, correct her version of reality. Her feelings about these moments were consistently dismissed as inaccurate, her memory treated like a faulty hard drive that needed constant debugging by the only person with the right password. What made it worse was how reasonable James always sounded. He never yelled, never called her stupid, never did anything that would look like abuse if you were watching from the outside. Instead, he'd tilt his head with that concerned expression and say things like, "Are you feeling okay? You seem confused lately, or maybe you should get more sleepy or mixing things up again." The emotional manipulation marriage playbook doesn't require cruelty. Sometimes it just requires consistency, the steady drip of doubt that wears away at someone's foundation until they're standing on nothing solid at all. Emma found herself checking and rechecking things obsessively. Did she lock the door? She thought she did, but maybe she was remembering wrong. Did her friend actually say Thursday or Friday for lunch? Better send a confirming text just to be sure. Had James told her he'd be late tonight, or was that yesterday? Or was she just confusing it with something else entirely? The protagonist who'd walked into that kitchen conversation sure of herself had been replaced by someone who questioned every perception, every memory, every instinct. And the worst part was how invisible this transformation was to everyone else. Compliance became easier than conflict, safer than trusting her own recall. When James corrected her in front of friends, "Actually, honey, that's not how it happened," she'd laugh it off and defer to his version. When he told her she'd agreed to something she had no memory of agreeing to, she'd go along with it rather than start an argument she'd probably lose anyway. The silent humiliation wasn't in any single moment, it was in the accumulation of small surrenders, the daily practice of choosing his reality over hers because somewhere along the way, she'd stopped believing her own mind was trustworthy. And James, for his part, seemed pleased with this new, more agreeable version of his wife. The turning point came on an unremarkable Thursday afternoon when James once again deployed his signature phrase during a discussion about their vacation plans. "You always remember things wrong, Em. I never said we'd go to the mountains, I said the beach." Emma felt the familiar pull to argue, to defend herself, to pull up old texts or emails as proof. But something stopped her this time, a small voice that sounded like the person she used to be before all this started. Instead of engaging, she simply nodded, said okay, and went back to folding laundry with hands that stayed remarkably steady. The protagonist staying calm wasn't surrender, it was observation. For the first time in months, Emma stepped outside the dynamic instead of drowning in it. She watched James' face as she failed to take the bait, noticed the micro-expression of confusion when she didn't scramble to justify her memory or apologize for her supposed mistake. There was no argument, no defense, no emotional display he could later cite as evidence of her irrationality. Just quiet acknowledgement followed by a return to the mundane task of matching socks, as if his correction had been as insignificant as a comment about the weather. What James didn't realize, what controlling husbands rarely realize when their tactics suddenly stop working, was that Emma's silence wasn't agreement. It was strategy, though she hadn't consciously planned it that way. Her internal observation had sharpened to a point where she could see the pattern playing out in real time: the setup, the correction, the expectation of her distress, the resolution where he'd magnanimously forgive her faulty memory. But when she refused to perform her part in the script, the whole production stalled awkwardly, like actors on stage when someone's forgotten their lines. That night, after James had gone to bed, Emma sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a notebook she'd grabbed from the junk drawer. She didn't have a plan exactly, just a nagging feeling that something needed to change, and that change had to start with her trusting herself again. The dark relationship drama she'd been living had taught her that arguing was useless, that defending only gave him more ammunition, that trying to convince him of her reality was like trying to hold water in her hands. So instead of fighting, she started writing just the date, the conversation, what she knew to be true. It felt small, almost silly, but it also felt like the first solid ground she'd stood on in months. The notebook became Emma's anchor to reality, a physical record that couldn't be rewritten by someone else's version of events. She started small, jotting down conversations right after they happened, noting what was said, when, and by whom. It wasn't dramatic or vindictive. She wasn't building a legal case or planning some grand confrontation. It was simpler and more profound than that. She was choosing to trust her own perception over Jameis' increasingly insistent corrections. The recognition of the recurring gaslighting pattern became undeniable when she could flip back through pages and see the same dynamic playing out over and over, like a song stuck on repeat. What struck her most was how often Jameis' corrections involved things that benefited him or proved her wrong. She'd supposedly forgotten he'd told her he needed the car on Tuesday, misremembered that he'd already paid a bill she could have sworn was still outstanding, confused the details of arguments where her valid concerns got reframed as her memory problems. The realization that memory was being weaponized hit her like cold water. This wasn't about her having a bad memory at all. This was about him having discovered that questioning her recall was an incredibly effective way to maintain control without ever having to acknowledge her legitimate grievances. Emma made a decision that would change everything. She would document instead of debate. When James told her she'd remembered something wrong, she'd smile, say maybe you're right, and then immediately write down exactly what she remembered with as much detail as possible. No more exhausting arguments where he'd twist her words until she couldn't remember what point she'd been trying to make. No more apologizing for having a different recollection. The shift from emotion to clarity was gradual but powerful, like focusing a camera lens until everything that had been blurry suddenly became sharp. The female empowerment story wasn't unfolding the way she'd imagined it might. There were no dramatic speeches, no moments where she threw his manipulation back in his face with evidence and righteous anger. Instead, it was quiet, methodical, almost boring in its consistency. Every day she'd record conversations, decisions, plans. She noted when he said he'd be home, what he claimed they'd agreed to, promises made and forgotten. The notebook lived in her nightstand, innocent-looking with its floral cover, but inside it held something James had spent years trying to destroy: her unwavering record of what was actually true. 3 months into her documentation project, Emma had filled nearly an entire notebook. Everything got written down, not obsessively, not paranoidly, but consistently. Dates, exact words when possible, witnesses if there were any, the context of conversations. She recorded when James said he'd mentioned something he definitely hadn't, when he claimed she'd agreed to plans she had no memory of, when he insisted events had unfolded differently than they actually had. The silent revenge marriage dynamic she'd stumbled into wasn't about hurting him back. It was about refusing to let her reality be erased anymore, one written sentence at a time. The power shift happened so gradually that James didn't notice it at first. Emma stopped arguing when he corrected her because she didn't need Tosh had her notes. When he'd insist she'd misremembered their conversation about finances, she'd simply nod and let it go, knowing she had the actual conversation documented with timestamps and details. The notes replaced arguments in a way that felt almost magical, like she'd discovered a cheat code for a game she'd been losing for years. Her consistency became her superpower, proof that she wasn't crazy or forgetful or confused, just married to someone who'd found it convenient to make her think she was. One evening, during another kitchen conversation, because apparently the kitchen was where their emotional manipulation marriage played out its greatest hits, James deployed his usual tactic. Emma, you're doing it again. I told you last week I couldn't go to your mom's on Saturday. You always remember things wrong. But this time, instead of doubting herself or scrambling to prove her case, Emma walked calmly to the bedroom, retrieved her notebook and flipped to the relevant page. Actually, she said, her voice steady and almost frighteningly calm, hey, erase our conversation from last Tuesday. You said, and I quote, sure we can do Saturday. I'll clear my schedule. The look on James' face was something Emma would remember forever, shock mixed with anger mixed with the dawning realization that his primary tool of control had just been neutralized. She wasn't hysterical, wasn't accusatory, wasn't even particularly emotional. She just had facts, written in her own handwriting, that contradicted his manufactured reality. The emotional power reversal wasn't loud or vengeful, it was quiet, documented, and absolutely irrefutable. For the first time in their marriage, James had to confront the possibility that maybe, just maybe, Emma's memory wasn't the problem at all. James' first instinct was to dismiss the notes entirely, to treat Emma's documentation as yet another sign of her supposed instability. "You're keeping notes on our conversations? That's actually kind of concerning, Em. Normal couples don't do that." He laughed, but it sounded hollow, forced, like he was trying to convince himself as much as her. The attempts to dismiss worked for about 30 seconds, until Emma calmly flipped to another page, then another, showing him a pattern so clear that even his practiced gaslighting couldn't obscure it. Each entry was dated, specific, undeniably a paper trail of his manipulation written in blue ink. The minimization intensified over the following days in ways that would have been almost comical if they weren't so desperate. James tried suggesting she was being obsessive, that writing everything down was a sign she needed therapy, that healthy relationships were built on trust, not documentation. "You're making me feel like I'm under surveillance in my own home," he said, playing the victim with an expertise born of years of practice. But Emma had learned something crucial from her toxic marriage story: the person who's telling the truth doesn't need to make others doubt their sanity. They just need to remember what actually happened. The panic set in when the patterns became too obvious to ignore. Emma started referencing her notes casually, almost conversationally. "Remember when you said I always forget to buy coffee? I've got 6 entries here where you specifically said you'd pick it up on your way home." Or, "Funny thing, you've told me I remembered things wrong 17 times this month, and in every single case my version turned out to be accurate when we checked." The controlling husband who'd spent years convincing her she couldn't trust her own mind was suddenly facing someone who had receipts, literal written receipts, of his manipulation. What terrified James most wasn't the notebook itself, it was what it represented. Emma had stopped seeking his validation, stopped accepting his version of reality as more legitimate than her own, stopped participating in the dance where he led and she stumbled. His authority, built entirely on her willingness to doubt herself, began to crumble like sandstone in the rain. He tried anger, tried guilt, tried that wounded confusion had always deployed so effectively. But you can't gaslight someone who's writing everything down, who's chosen clarity over his comfort, who's decided that her memory documented, consistent, and accurate matters more than his need to rewrite history. Erase the truth that Emma learned, and that anyone experiencing similar dynamics needs to understand: memory isn't the problem, manipulation is. When someone consistently tells you that you remember things wrong, they're not helping you improve your recall or gently correcting innocent mistakes. They're systematically undermining your confidence in your own perception of reality, making you dependent on their version of events, ensuring that you'll always defer to their narrative because you've been trained to distrust your own. The gaslighting memory manipulation works precisely because it's so insidious, so wrapped in concern and patience, that you don't realize you're being dismantled until you can barely recognize yourself anymore. The revolutionary discovery, the one that changes everything, just that truth survives when it's recorded. Words spoken into air can be denied, reframed, reinterpreted until they mean whatever the manipulator needs them to mean. But words written down, with dates and details and context, become something solid, something that can't be reshaped by someone else's convenient amnesia or strategic reinterpretation. Emma's notebook wasn't just a record of conversations, it was proof that her mind worked perfectly fine, that her memory was reliable, and that the problem had never been her cognitive function but rather her husband's need to control the narrative. What happens to gaslighting when you introduce consistency? It collapses completely and utterly, like a house of cards in a strong wind. The whole strategy depends on the victim's uncertainty, on their willingness to accept that maybe they really are confused, forgetful, or unreliable. But when you can flip back through pages of accurate predictions, correct recollections, and validated memories, that uncertainty evaporates. "James, you always remember things wrong" lost its power the moment Emma could respond with "Actually, erase what you said on Tuesday at 6:47 p.m., and erase the context, and erase how I knew even then that you'd deny it later." The most powerful position Emma ever held in her marriage came not from confrontation or ultimatums or dramatic exits, but from silence backed by facts. She didn't need to argue anymore, didn't need to convince James or anyone else of her reality, didn't need to perform emotional labor to prove she wasn't crazy. The dark relationship drama transformed into something unexpected, a quiet reclamation of self-trust, one documented conversation at a time. Power restored through the simple radical act of believing her own experience and writing it down before someone could tell her it had never happened. And that notebook, with its innocent floral cover and pages filled with truth, became the thing that set her free. So hey Race, what I need you to ask yourself right now, in this very moment: when was the last time someone made you doubt your own memory? When did you last apologize for misremembering something you were actually right about? Because if you're reading this and feeling that uncomfortable twist of recognition in your gut, if you're thinking about conversations where you backed down not because you were wrong but because it was easier than fighting to defend your own reality, you need to understand that your memory probably isn't the problem. The problem is that someone has discovered that making you doubt yourself is an incredibly effective form of control. Think about what would happen if you started writing things down. Not in an obsessive, paranoid way, but simply recording conversations, decisions, promises made and conveniently forgotten. What patterns might emerge if you had 3 months of documented interactions to review? Would you discover, like I did, that the person telling you always remember things wrong is actually the one rewriting history to suit their needs? This isn't about building a case for divorce court or planning some dramatic confrontation. It's about giving yourself the gift of clarity, of seeing the gaslighting memory manipulation for what it actually is when it's laid out in black and white on paper. The truth is, you don't need anyone's permission to trust yourself. You don't need consensus, you don't need validation, you don't need your partner to agree that yes, they did say that thing they're now claiming they never said. You just need consistency, your own steady, reliable record of what actually happened, when it happened, and how it made you feel. The emotional manipulation marriage dynamics that seem so confusing in the moment become crystal clear when you can look back at patterns, see the same script playing out over and over with different details, but the same ultimate goal, making you doubt your reality so thoroughly that you'll defer to theirs. What are you going to do with this information? Are you going to keep apologizing for having a bad memory that probably works just fine? Or are you going to start documenting, observing, trusting your own experience even when someone you love tells you it's inaccurate? The controlling husband, the gaslighting partner, the person who's invested in keeping you uncertain, they only have power as long as you're willing to doubt yourself more than you doubt them. And today, right now, you can start shifting that balance. Grab a notebook, start writing, and watch what happens when you introduce facts into a relationship built on manufactured confusion. If this story resonated with you, if you saw pieces of your own dark relationship drama in these words, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, because we're going to keep exploring these truths that don't get discussed enough. You're not crazy. Your memory isn't broken. And you deserve to trust yourself again. The kitchen gaslighting, the silent humiliation, the constant corrections, they end the moment you decide your documented reality matters more than someone else's convenient fiction. So pick up that pen. Your truth is waiting to be written.